into the different layers of that onion that is tornado trauma.
Is Mr. Boyce gonna come over here? Come here. Come here. He might come over here. Come here. Hi. He's coming. Mr. Boyce. Bye.
What on earth? I have before me one of, if not the most ridiculous setups that have ever existed. Here we are. The neighbors are tap dancing above me. Blaze's Duck TV is on in the background. Half of my bedroom is just dedicated to him and his TV and various things that he has. And the setup that I have in front of me was intentional in an effort to be more intimate and have the acoustics be a little bit better, but is chaotic. But I guess that is very on brand for me. I have gathered you all here today to introduce a sort of new format of video that I want to do. I guess I should just call it a podcast, although I sort of admittedly hate using that word because in my personal life I always say that I don't think most people need a microphone, and I understand that I'm very hypocritical saying that as I am speaking to you now, and and I do really stand by that, but I also felt that a sort of podcast style would be important for me and for this channel for a couple of reasons. The first being that the way that I do my videos and the way that I present myself has always been very purposely incredibly scripted and sort of a product that I've created. In a lot of ways that's not true to myself, and although this is a parasocial relationship, I have talked with so many of you about many of your personal experiences that mirror my own, and I've had so many wonderful friends that I've made through this channel and through what I do on social media. So it's important to me that I in some ways reciprocate and feel like I'm being a more honest version of myself. The second and arguably more important reason that I wanted to have these sort of sit down podcast type discussions with you all is because I think there is a lot of room in this space within the weather enterprise to have discussions not only with other professionals, be it storm chasers, mental health professionals, meteorologists, social scientists, so many different people. There are so many different walks of life and professional inputs that can be inserted into a conversation about the weather community, and I think it's a great time to have some of that dialogue. By no means do I think I'm doing anything groundbreaking here, but for me, I actually, outside of making YouTube videos in my personal life, am so invested in reading the publications of brilliant people within the space. So this kind of podcast sit down will be interchangeably me talking about publications and different science to uplift different voices and studies that I think are great and insightful. And there's also going to be different guests we're going to have on. I've already spoken with 7 or 8 different people who have agreed to come on very graciously. These are largely friends that I've made in the community that are a lot of y'all's favorites too. So we're going to have some really exciting guests come on. But for today's inaugural post, I wanted to talk about my favorite recent study and just have a sort of introductory discussion with you all. And yeah, I actually did want to kick off this first episode with the first guest that I have lined up, but they are a chaser, and as you all know, today is May 23rd. It has been a horrific past couple of weeks. For I would say easily a month now. There have been multiple strong to violent tornadoes that have damaged so many different communities, and we're continuing that pattern today. Today's Thursday. I'm working this weekend. This weekend looks busy as well. So it's really not the week for me to be interviewing my first guest right now. I've already talked to him extensively about trying to get this plan, and I've been trying to do this with him for 3 weeks now. So I just said, hey, we're going to do it when it slows down. So obviously, because this is the Two Storms podcast, haven't come up with a name yet. Everything I do is essentially going to be sponsored by my own brand. So if you want to check out twostorms.co, got a lot of great new launches going on over there. These are going to be part of a new launch coming out for the Twister movie. It's going to be a special edition Twisters launch. So I have these earrings, and I also have this Twister pin I'll insert a picture of. And I'm also waiting on a new design for the shirts. I can't leak the design yet because I'm really paranoid about it, but they'll be here soon. They're so cool. Y'all gotta get with the program. Go to twostorms.co. You can pick from I didn't do that, but go to twostorms.co. Support 3 different charities of your choosing. That's it. I would encourage you to check them out or support them if you can. They are in the middle of fundraising because they have been so busy for the past month. It's just there for people if they are willing and able to donate. It's never an obligation, but that fundraiser will be down there so long as this video is there. So without further ado, I know that was a ton of verbal vomit, which is very typical for me. Let's get into today's topic. I had a hard time picking between 3 studies that I have been holding on to for essentially a year. You can see this one has just been written all over. I also recently found one about the socioeconomic impacts of tornadoes, but I chose for our inaugural post to do one written by 2 badass women, and this publication is called The Mental Health Impacts of Tornadoes, a Systematic Review. This article was written by Sangwon Lee and Jennifer M. First, and I'll have the links to their professional bios from the University of Tennessee in the description. I myself am a hillbilly from East Tennessee, so it's extra special that this is a study done by 2 really badass women who are working near my hometown. By the way, this is the very first publication that I've seen, not that they don't exist, but that I've seen specifically discussing the mental health implications from tornadoes. There are a lot of other studies about natural disasters, particularly from hurricanes and things like flooding and earthquakes, but tornadoes, not so much. And we'll talk about that more later. I'm just going to be referencing my laptop, which is right here. So if I'm looking over this way, I'm looking at my laptop and sometimes referencing the study, but I have all my notes in my laptop. Stick with me here, okay? The abstract begins as follows. Tornadoes are one of the most prevalent natural hazards in the United States, yet they have been underrepresented in the disaster mental health comprehensive literature. In the current study, we systematically reviewed available scientific evidence within published research journals on tornadoes and mental health from 1994 to 2021. Okay? So this publication essentially is going to be a general overview of prior studies that have been done. They found 384 articles to date, only 29 of which met the criteria for mental health in regards to tornadoes, and it represents roughly 27,000 participants in total. In this study, they have identified 4 broad areas that we're going to be focusing on today. The first one is the mental health impacts of tornadoes. The second are risk factors. The third are protective factors, and the fourth being mental health interventions. Now, here's what it states. Overall, results showed adverse mental health symptoms, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety in both adults and pediatric populations. A number of risk factors were found to contribute to negative mental health, including demographics, tornado exposure, post-tornado stressors, and prior exposure to trauma. Obviously, these are all kind of discussions within themselves, so we'll have an entirely other conversation about demographics and their relation to severe weather impacts and tornado impacts. And then prior tornado stressors and previous trauma. That is probably a discussion on prior trauma and tornadoes that I could extensively have. I think there's a lot to say about people who have previous trauma or PTSD who are negatively impacted by severe weather days. I don't know how much I'll talk about it in depth, but my prior traumas cause a lot of anxiety for me when it comes to severe weather days. I grew up afraid of weather as a child. As I got older and now that I'm an adult, it's been expedited by various sort of traumatizing events for me. So it's to the point now where when there are severe weather days, they're kind of, I hate to use the word trigger, but they sort of induce a lot of anxiety for me. And that is something that I constantly have to work at. I know I'm not the only one by far. It's not even so much as having storm anxiety at that point, but rather having sort of other anxieties or traumas that are essentially triggered by severe weather, amongst other things. It is something I care about a lot and I have a lot of personal experience in, and something I think is worth having another video discussion about. All right, so moving on, we're still talking about the abstract here, so the general overview goes on to say, quote, protective factors found to contribute to positive outcomes include having access to physical, social, and psychological resources. Together, these findings can serve as an important resource for future mental health services in communities experiencing tornadoes. So that was the abstract, which is the kind of general overview of the findings and what we're going to be talking about. So let's dive into the meat of this document and some of the statistics. In the United States, there are more than 1,200 tornadoes every year, contributing to more than 15,000 tornado-related fatalities since the year 1900. The average number of tornadoes has increased since the year 1954, and the likelihood of extreme tornadoes continues to increase, which could exacerbate the severity of losses and negative effects of tornadoes in the future. That's directly from this. I'm actually wondering now if the average number of tornadoes, I'm not denying global warming, by the way. I'm just saying that I wonder if the average number of tornadoes has increased because we have the ability to spot tornadoes much easier on radar now than we did in 1954. If you think about the radars that were used in 1954 up until the 1990s, they were World War II technology. And to be honest, I don't know scientists now in 2024 even have a total understanding of the implication of global warming on tornadoes. That's something I've heard various experts talk about, and from what I've seen, I'm happy to be wrong, from what I've seen, I don't know that they're able to point to a very specific correlation of global warming increasing the number of tornadoes. I think it is absolutely possible, but it's probably something we're going to have to wait another decade to get better data on. That is just my thought process. Now, here's where we're going to shift a little bit towards the mental health here. Quote, while being directly exposed to a tornado can result in death, injury, and physical damage to buildings and property, it can also have long-term effects on people's mental health. And in fact, we know that statistically your likelihood of being, first of all, impacted by a tornado, let alone being injured seriously or being killed by a tornado, are very, very, very low. You, in fact, have a much greater statistical chance of being traumatized by a tornado than anything. Now, it goes on to say that emotional stress, anxiety, depression, PTSD, sleep disorder, and suicidal ideation have been reported as mental health problems experienced by victims after severe weather events. These psychological symptoms can occur in the immediate aftermath of exposure and can persist over months or even years. that is something I think I've talked about in a PTSD discussion before, and or in the Joplin video. There was a study done specifically on the victims of the Joplin tornado pertaining to literally just PTSD. And they had found that the symptoms of PTSD had shown up, particularly in adolescence, much later down the road. I want to say the majority of those who had PTSD, it didn't show up for between 6 months to 2.5 years after the event itself. It goes on to say, quote, in addition, people living with adverse mental health symptoms in post-extreme weather events reported a lower quality of life and functional impairments in social, vocational, and physical areas. That's a lot. And I think it might be easy to look at this and say, well, why haven't we done more comprehensive literature on the impacts mentally from tornadoes? And that is really simply because when you compare tornadoes to any other natural disaster, tornadoes are extremely localized, and the number of people who are actually physically or mentally impacted from tornadoes is pretty small when you are talking about collecting data for a study. So there have been a lot more publications on, let's say, the mental impacts of hurricanes. Hurricane Katrina, a lot of literature was published from Hurricane Katrina. All right, now we're going to move on to the findings of the 4 areas that we've highlighted, which are mental health impacts, the risk factors, protective factors, and mental health interventions. So we're going to discuss what this study finds and concludes, and then I'm going to add some of my thoughts at the end. All right, so findings from the mental health impacts are as follows. A. PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorders were found in multiple studies which revealed that residents exposed to tornadoes reported PTSD or PTSD-related symptoms. I think we kind of know that already. The degree of tornado exposure, gender, age, emotional support, and barriers to a tornado warning were factors related to post-tornado PTSD. PTSD was also found to be related to other mental and behavioral health needs, such as depression, binge drinking, or substance abuse. That is a big one. We're not just talking about anxiety and depression. We're talking about real stuff that people are genetically predispositioned to have. We're talking about things that are very serious, like binge drinking, binge eating, suicidal ideation. We talked about that for a second, and substance abuse. These are events that can really send people on a downward spiral, and it is so horrifying and sad to think about yourself or your family member or your friend as someone who is already inclined to have obsessive or addictive behaviors, or maybe even not. To watch someone go down that path because of an event like this is something I can't even begin to imagine. Going on, studies also found that women were more likely to report PTSD symptoms than men after a tornado, and one study found that men were more likely to report depression symptoms following the Joplin 2011 tornado. I think I talked about this specifically in a Joplin PTSD discussion, so I'll have that linked if you guys haven't seen that one and you want to watch it. It focuses solely on PTSD. All right, finding B. Okay, so sorry, A was PTSD. I go off on such a tangent. A was PTSD. Section B is depression. Okay, so we found that depression was also a common mental health consequence experienced months after the tornado, but also 2.5 years later. Okay, they are specifically referencing the Joplin study, so I'll have that linked. I go over that extensively in details. All right, C is anxiety. So several studies reported an elevated prevalence of generalized anxiety disorder following tornadoes. In 6 out of 29 studies, the level of anxiety was measured using the differential sentiment scale, the OSU PTSD scale, or was measured through an interview. All right, the next 2 are a little bit more heavy. Not that the previous ones weren't, but we're going to be talking a little bit more about substance abuse, alcohol abuse, and suicidal ideation. So I'm just going to put a little bit of a trigger warning here if those aren't things that you're interested in listening to, we are about to dive in. I'll have a time stamp to when you can fast forward to. Studies examining increased alcohol consumption in adolescents after tornadoes were found to be significantly influenced by previous trauma history and current levels of tornado-related PTSD. Substance abuse disorder was found to be associated with post-traumatic stress disorder and major depressive episodes following exposure to tornadoes. Girls were significantly more likely than boys to meet the diagnosis criteria of comorbidity for PTSD and major depressive episode and substance abuse disorders. There's so many different levels to that, right? Because you could be someone who is in a situation where maybe you're an adolescent and you have parents or people in your family or your friends who have issues with drugs or alcohol or substance abuse, and you're kind of exposed to that your entire life. You might have people who have never been exposed to drug or alcohol abuse who are, let's say, injured in a tornado that are then prescribed, let's say, some kind of pill or medicine that has an addictive quality about it, an addictive nature, and they fall down this path of really tragically becoming addicted to substances. And that is actually, I would imagine, a more common issue than we might think. So we kind of know that here in America, doctors are more than happy to prescribe you harder pills. And that is a really unfortunate truth. Not to say that people don't need pain medicine when they are injured. I absolutely believe in the power of medicine, but it is also really difficult to talk about and to see people who fall down the hole of substance abuse because they need a pain medication, and it is really easy to slide down that very slippery slope. So I think substance and alcohol abuse is an entire other discussion, but I think it's important to highlight here because it's probably one of those things that really happens in this community that isn't kind of out in the light. I think it's a sort of really dark truth about being the victim of a natural disaster. I don't know. That's kind of heavy. Sorry, I didn't mean for that to get so dark. Well, it's going to keep getting darker. Okay. And E, which again, trigger warning here, suicidal ideation. About 5% of 2,000 adolescents who experienced the Joplin and Tuscaloosa tornadoes in the spring of 2011 reported suicidal ideation. Intimate partner violence exposure was also found to be significantly related to post-tornado suicidal ideation. That is super dark as well. I won't talk about the specifics, but if you've been in the community for some time or you're kind of in the depths of the weather community, you'll be familiar with a few different stories of adolescents who ended up taking their lives some years and years after. It is one of the reasons why I really haven't talked about more in Tuscaloosa. I just find the entire thing to be so tragic that I don't even know how to begin to unpack something as serious as suicide ideation and actual suicides that have happened as a direct result of the trauma, the mental trauma that occurred from these violent tornadoes. Survivor's guilt is another really powerful factor here. And again, that's something I've talked about before. It's real. It's very real. And it happens, and we know it happens. I don't know what the solution is, but I think the first step is to at least have the discussions about them and to let people know that there are resources out there currently for people who might be experiencing mental trauma from severe weather or mental trauma generally speaking. And there are people who are more than willing and happy to help. All right, moving on to section 2. Because there's really no good way to end that previous discussion, we're going to talk about the findings of risk factors, section 2. All right, this section serves to present risk factors that were found to contribute to adverse mental health after a tornado, okay? All right, the first factor, gender and age. Multiple studies found that females with lower levels of education and lower household income were more vulnerable to adverse mental health after tornado events. Okay, section 2, race and ethnicity. 2 articles addressed specific challenges that African American and Hispanic populations faced in the context of tornadoes. Black and Hispanic residents who reported difficulties receiving tornado warning alerts experienced more tornado exposure and adverse mental health impacts, and the intersections of ethnicity, language difficulties, citizenship, pre-mental health symptoms, and social class were also found to contribute to additional stressors. All right, next is C, economic factors. Having lower income, renting, having debt, not having insurance, and financial loss of material resources were the significant risk factors for post-tornado adverse mental health symptoms. That is not a secret. This is something we're going to talk about more in a different study called the socioeconomics. The socioeconomic impacts of tornadoes. You'll see that actually they did this cool graphic of a money tornado, which I thought was pretty creative. We're going to talk a lot more about vulnerabilities and socioeconomic status in that study. So, okay, next, D is tornado exposure. Multiple studies have identified that tornado exposure, which is defined as having injury, loss to a loved one, or property damage, is a strong factor that is linked to negative mental health for children, youth, adults, and reported PTSD. I think that is not shocking by any stretch of the imagination. Greater severity of tornado exposure was also associated with alcohol use by adolescents. I would imagine the greater exposure that you would have, the greater the severity of trauma, but I could be wrong about that correlation. Finally, we're going to talk about the last 2 portions of this, which are the protective factors and mental health intervention. Protective factors, we're going to talk about 2. The first is coping response factors, and the second is social support. Coping responses found to have a positive impact on personal recovery and mental health included dispositional optimism, self-efficacy, and hope. There's got to be something better than that. I mean, they're good. Of course, I believe in hope and optimism too, but I think there's got to be better coping responses than that, right? All right, section B is social support. Multiple studies found that social resources were positively associated with higher levels of resilience and negatively related to adverse mental health outcomes following tornadoes. That's a weird way to word that. Social resources are associated with better outcomes, essentially. One study finds that environments with fewer social resources and support influenced the risk of alcohol consumption and alcohol use. And finally, perceived social support was found to reduce PTSD symptoms and increase post-traumatic growth. That's interesting. Among participants affected by the tornado in Jiangsu in Yancheng in China. I'll have to look that up. That's interesting. I didn't know they did mental health studies on tornadoes in China. 早上好，中国，我很喜欢冰淇淋。All right, we're going to talk about the final section, which is mental health interventions, okay? In this section, what they've done is detail interventions found to support mental health following the exposure to tornadoes. So we're kind of concluding with some feasible solutions here, which is my favorite way to conclude this. All right, so in this section, we're going to be talking about 2 interventions that were done once again post-Joplin to help children and adolescents in their recovery that were utilized and were somewhat successful. So let's talk about them. The first one's called Journey of Hope, okay? Journey of Hope is a program designed for young people exposed to disasters who do not meet the diagnostic criteria for formal mental health symptoms, but experience emotional distress. That's important. This intervention uses a school-based psychosocial curriculum that includes 8 sessions aimed at improving the emotional management of children and adolescents by improving protective parameters such as social support, coping, and psychological education. Sounds like a wonderful program. All right, the second one, number 2, is called the Bounce Back Now program, BBN. All right, the BBN, the Bounce Back Now program is a web-based intervention and consists of 5 standalone modules that intervene with PTSD, depression, smoking, alcohol use, and parenting for adolescents at risk for post-disaster mental health problems. Youth and their parents were randomly assigned to the web-based Jesus Christ, can I read? Do I have a degree in literature? The eventual results from families that participated from Joplin and various areas around Alabama impacted by tornadoes, it was a positive result. So overall net positive there with the BBN program. This specific study is not the first time anyone has analyzed the mental health impacts post-tornado. Obviously, we've talked about other ones on this channel. This essentially is the first kind of comprehensive study examining specifically in a standalone way the mental health impacts and factors from a tornado. It's a great look into the different layers of that onion that is tornado trauma, for lack of a better term. What are you looking at, Blaze? Now, there's one final segment of this I want to talk about, and that is gaps in research. Now, one thing that's important to me is to talk about the fact that there are some research gaps that exist that are noted both here and in other places as well, where essentially you'll have a group of people that are essentially non-existent within this literature space, within the tornado literature space. Some of the groups of people who are essentially invisible in the space are the elderly population, people with disabilities, and the LGBTQ community. And for the elderly to be sort of not mentioned in a lot of these studies is interesting because they are the most at risk for injury and death. One of the biggest issues is the fact that they're not able to quickly get to shelter without assistance in a lot of cases. And this is something we could also talk about with the disabled community. You've got a real lack of research that's done on folks who are disabled who need to get into tornado shelters, who may not have accessibility to tornado shelters and various resources. So it's a total other conversation that we can have, in addition to the final group of people that I want to discuss, which is the LGBTQIA community. And they are, as mentioned in this study, essentially invisible when it comes to tornado research. People who are in the LGBTQIA community are more likely to experience social isolation. They are more likely to endure disrespect from other people. They are more likely to endure harassment in places like emergency shelters in the aftermath of a disaster. So you can imagine how hard that must be for people who are in a marginalized group and have to even think about going to a place where they might be harassed or made to feel any type of way when it comes to just being in a safe place during a natural disaster. I think in a way it is most important that we talk about marginalized groups in this community specifically because they are actually literally statistically underrepresented in a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about. So maybe it's just discussions that we need to kind of have on our own outside of scientific papers, and that's fine with me. We can have that discussion, and of course I'm going to have people on this podcast who are who can speak to different underrepresented communities and how we can better support them within this space. So yeah, that was kind of the concluding thought with some research gaps. I really liked this study. It isn't super heavy on statistics, even though I feel like I read a lot of data. This is actually just kind of a pretty general overview of what the risk factors and different impacts mentally are for tornadoes, in a comprehensive piece here. But truly, I do want you guys to share with me what you think about not only this specific discussion, but kind of what you want to see talked about or discussed in this format. If you all have any particular pieces or stories that you want me to analyze, or I guess even people that you want to hear their perspective on, let me know and I'll do my very best to cater to that. And I am honestly just so very excited to have a little bit more of I don't want to say personal, but maybe a little bit more intimate of a discussion with you guys that I don't have to be so rigid and scripted for. Everything I do on my main channel is so heavily scripted, and like I said, it's intentional. I mean, I want the videos that I make on my main channel, the documentary style, to be like informative and not too blabby, because the truth is I could really blab about this stuff for a long time, but maybe it's nice to be a little bit more chatty with you all and talk about some of my personal experiences. Anyways, I think this is a great opportunity for me to decompress a little bit, because between doing this, doing the Two Storms stuff, and also my regular job, I'm constantly seeing and exposed to these really horrible events that, frankly, this past month I haven't decompressed from. I haven't found the right way to totally decompress. It's kind of hard to when this is your job. It's like, how do you really decompress from something that you have to look at and be exposed to? So I think we should all, if able, take a step back and be thankful for what we do have right now, which is today. Let's be thankful for today. And I don't really have an intro or an outro yet, but maybe we'll figure that out along the way. Okay. So, if you guys have any like interesting names you want to see for this podcast, because I'm just going to name it Two Storms Podcast, let me know. And let me know what suggestions or topics you guys want to touch on here, and we'll get to it. Thank you for being here. I will see you all in my next video. Bye.